The next of our speakers is Don Wood. Don is an independent scholar, so not somebody immersed in the university world that our other speakers are, but somebody with a strong local West Cork connection, which perhaps he will tell us a little about, and somebody who's just both been part of discussions and engaged in his own research on the long-term impact on the Protestant community in West Cork of the violence that we're talking about today in 1922. Don, over to you.
Thank you.
Yes, Don.
Just give me 1 second. Just so we have you for the stream. If you put that in your pocket. Right. That'd be great. And I'll just clip this on here.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, right. I hope this works. Good afternoon, all. My name is Don Wood. So I was born in, not so much this area, I was born in a small village called Coppeen, which is about equidistant from Bale-na-Blaw and Kilmichael. Unlike the most of our neighbours, we were Protestants, but that didn't make any difference to us in the 1950s. So my view of it starts from then, and I researched it much more deeply later. So when I was a small child in West Cork in the 50s, I knew little about what actually happened. We had, however, heard little about the murder of one local man who lived a few miles from us. His name was Robert Howe, and he lived beside the school where my father went and his 4 sisters went to school at various times between 1910 and 1930. From this, we concocted this fantasy story how our father had found the body, even, as he went to school the following morning. But anyway, that was about the sum total. For a long time, that remained our only version of the Bandon Valley killings. Our parents spoke about it little or not at all, in fact, nor did our childhood friends. Yet the events of 1922 were still very much part of our world. One of our more bizarre childhood toys was an old rusty rifle, which we had found in some undergrowth on the farm. And he'd been left behind by an anti-treaty IRA man billeted on our farm in the autumn of 1922. Our daily route to school passed by 3 of the murder scenes. Our primary school teacher's husband was one of those who had been targeted and very narrowly escaped. It was only much later, while delving into local history matters some 40 years on, that the subject really ever came up again. Sorry, I'll get used to this idea. Right. First of all, let's look at what West Cork looked like in the aftermath of the treaty. It was signed in January 1922 and was soon followed by the beginnings of the IRA split that led to the Civil War, as various parts of the IRA decided whether to support or oppose it. Niles Connolly, the IRA leader in Skibbereen, was about the only local leader, in fact, who actually supported the treaty. Everybody else in the rank and file were pretty well against. So for most West Cork Protestants, relief at signing the treaty and the prospect of return to relatively peaceful times was quickly replaced by some fear and apprehension. With the disbandment of the RIC, Ireland was left with no real police force. Garda Síochána hadn't yet been established, and the Free State Army certainly hadn't reached West Cork. What local policing there was in the hands of the IRA. As Willie Kingston, a young solicitor in Skibbereen at the time, summed up the atmosphere, any man with a gun was a law unto himself. Now, in early February, the auxiliaries vacated their stronghold in the workhouse in Manway, and the IRA quickly moved in and established a garrison there under the command of Peter Carney, who was very much an anti-treaty man. In Ballineen, they established a small force in the former Cotter bakery at the west end of the village. Alfred Cotter had been shot by the IRA after a dispute, and this was in 1921, which had escalated after he had refused to stop supplying bread to the RIC. So the treaty and the withdrawal of British forces notwithstanding, local IRA units continued to pursue those they saw as their enemies. In February 1922, Michael Keeney, a former district inspector of the now disbanded RIC, was murdered and his teenage son seriously injured during Clonakilty. Then in the same month, a local Protestant farmer in Kenna was accused of spying for the British. And now I'm aware of two versions of this story. His Irish Grants Committee compensation claimed that he was subjected to a trial on a charge of spying, but as he put it himself, he just escaped being shot. The family version, as related to me by his daughter-in-law, was that armed men had arrived at the house. He was stood up against a wall and was about to be shot, only to be saved by the family maid, who rushed out and stood in front of her employer and berated the execution squad so vehemently that they turned and left. Commercial activities also created problems for some people. William Goodwood, a Skibbereen auctioneer and part of my family, extended family, received a threatening letter about March 1922 from Jim Hurley, the commanding officer of Clonakilty IRA. This was over an auction of surplus British Army equipment that Wood had organised right here in Lassard in February. Wood, Fitzmaurice and Jasper Wolfe had also fallen foul of the IRA over tree felling operations on the Carberry Castletree estate that they'd bought a few years earlier. Now, it may not be coincidental that all three were targeted in April 1922. Now, also to give you some impression, on April the 1st, the Southern Star published a poem about the killing of the Coffey brothers. These were two young IRA men who had died in February 1921 at the hands of some say a raiding party that involved local Protestants. Part of the poem was a strident denunciation of any locals suspected of being involved, and as you can see, it's saying it's time, they haven't got their British protectors around anymore, beware. So, but I think it's a bit of an indication of sort of the atmosphere of the place at the time. All that was needed really was somebody to light the match. Now, if we start at Ballygroman, of course, which did provide the spark. This was an IRA raid on the home of Samuel Hornibrook at Ballygroman by a detachment from Bandon in the early hours of Wednesday, 27th of April, and the killing of Michael O'Neill by Herbert Woods. We're not quite sure why they went there. First of all, it was outside their area, because Ballygroman was in Cork number 1 Brigade, I think, whereas Bandon was part of West Cork number 3 Brigade. So, but anyway, standoff ensued until the Hornibrooks and Woods surrendered the following morning, after which they were taken away and killed, and their bodies have never been conclusively found. In Dunmanway, then things started going awry. On Dunmanway on Wednesday night, Francis Fitzmaurice, James Buttermore and David Gray were shot at their homes around midnight, sometime around midnight, and others were attacked and sought. On Thursday night, there were more attacks in Kenna and Ballinean area, where 5 more men were killed and others attacked or sought out. In Moraa, the Reverend Ralph Harbord was attacked and seriously injured as he returned to the rectory. In the Clonakilty area, 16-year-old Robert Nagle was murdered by men searching for his father, and others were also targeted but escaped. In Skibbereen on the Thursday night, Jasper Wolfe and William Goodwood were both visited. Wolfe was absent and Wood escaped. Now, Tom Hales ordered to try to put a stop to the killings on Friday, and it's reported that IRA leaders hurried south from their meetings in Dublin to try and restore order and discipline. Notwithstanding that, John Bradfield was killed in Killowen on Saturday night. Now, while some 13 Protestants were killed, assaults and intended assaults, were directed at least probably 20 other people or families. But a combination of incompetence and bad planning probably limited the death toll. Some potential victims had the foresight to make themselves scarce. Others put up, in the case of George Bryan of Manway, the gun being used to shoot him failed to function and he made a run for it. Sorry, excuse me. Richard Helen in Clonakilty escaped from his captors as he was being led to his execution. When Willie Dant was approached by armed men at his home in Ballineen, he responded by saying that he too was armed and was willing to shoot back. His assailants fired a few shots at the house and moved on down the street for easier targets. Willie Dant fled to Wales and returned when things were safer in December 1922. But I suppose, imagine, what if we were talking about 35 dead today. But luckily we're not. And then there's the case of mistaken identity. There were some also suggested Ralph Harbord was maybe shot in mistake for a brother who had been in the British Army. Harbord had been a curate in Limerick during the War of Independence, and so was an unlikely British spy in West Cork, I thought. It has suggested that young McKinley in Ballineen wasn't the intended target in his family, but to be honest, I find it difficult to find out what other member of the family might have been the actual target. I think they just didn't like him. Robert Howe of Ballinure might have been shot because of a different Howe who lived some 5 kilometres away. But this too seems an unlikely mistake. They only had to check with the local IRA company captain, Howe's next door neighbour. Then there was those killed on the basis that anybody will do. Young Robert Nagle was shot because his murderers couldn't find their real target, his father. The killers questioned him about his age and his Saturday job and decided he was old enough to die. John Bradfield was a cripple, unable to go into hiding as his brother did. So unable to find his brother, they shot him. In summary, these killings were far from carefully planned strikes against known enemies. They bear all the hallmarks of a mindless lashing out at whatever targets they could find, based as much on personal dislike and prejudice as on actual intelligence. So, how do they select their victims? So let me first look at the spies and informers argument. Now, Meader Ryan claimed that the names of those who were all found in the infamous Manway diary. This is the intelligence officer's notebook that the IRA found when they occupied the workhouse in Dunmanway. And indeed, the diary is still about. It's in the military archives. But what's missing from it is any mention of any of the victims of April. There was a loose sheet attached, which he said contained the names, and there is one which actually contains 15 names with no indication of why they're listed. It should be pointed out that there's 11 of those were Catholic and 4 Protestant, and none of them were attacked. Now, the other thing is, the other big list that the IRA had of who they suspected was one was a return made in 1922 by supposedly all IRA battalions were asked to make a return of who had committed crimes against the state and helped the British, etc., etc. The form asked them to give details of individuals, their past and current addresses, the crimes they had committed, the dates and places where these crimes were committed, and any supporting evidence of the offence. Cork No. 3 Brigade Bandon didn't provide a return, but there were returns from Clonakilty, Dunmanway and Skibbereen. So how does the January list compare with who was targeted in April? On the left-hand side, there's 21 names which were people the IRA listed as being suspects from Dunmanway, Clonakilty and Skibbereen. Now, I've excluded from the list people the IRA said had already left the district, and I've also excluded all women because they didn't actually. There was lots of names on it. Girls who went out, the soldiers and that sort of thing. So on the right-hand side now, we've got a list of 24 people who were targeted in those battalion areas. And in the middle, we've got 5 names in common. So you see, they certainly weren't working from this list. So the question is, where did they get their intelligence from? The other thing is, about the list is that the religious makeup of the two lists is significant. The January list consists of 12 Protestants and 9 Catholics. The April list is 24 Protestants and 1 pub owner that I've listed in Manway who had his pub shot at while they went past. There is talk of another Catholic, an ex-RIC man, but when you read his statement, he actually wasn't targeted. He was afraid he was going to be targeted and hid in the graveyard. Now, I don't propose to go through all the victims one by one, but I'll give you a detailed account of Robert Howe of Prospect Cottage. Now, he was a bit of a blow-in, so he wasn't related to any of the Howe families of the parish, and had been born near Ballinspittle, which is near Kinsale. He was the product of mixed marriage, and in 1857 he had been baptized Catholic. So he lived at the family home until his mid-30s. Then he moved to Kennet to manage the farm at Ballinure, a Prospect Cottage, belonging to the widow of Joseph Fuller, who had died in 1894, leaving his widow and just 3 daughters. Now, Robert was active in promoting the cooperative movement locally and donating land and buildings and the building of a creamery. The nearby road junction is still called Creamery Cross, despite the creamery being long gone. Despite his Catholic baptism, Robert's 1901 census entry declared that he was a member of the Church of Ireland. He married one of the Fuller daughters in 1903 and assumed full control of the farm. Now, the other thing I found out about Robert was that he made some donations to William O'Brien's sort of moderate nationalist parties, both of them, in fact. There are 2 entries in the Southern Star, one in 1901 and one some years later. So, to me, Howe doesn't really sound even like a loyalist. I'd put him as a sort of a fairly middle-of-the-road nationalist, actually, if anything. It should be pointed out that there were other Protestant names donating to William O'Brien, by the way, including the Chinnery family, whose son was also killed. So let's look at the aftermath. Was this an isolated incident of discipline? Sorry, excuse me. In response to Michael O'Neill's killing, or had it been stopped in its tracks by swift response of the IRA leadership? And let's look at a few incidents that followed it. The following day, when the Paytons, who hid out after when Gerald McKinley was killed in Ballineen, returned and were told to get out of the place. They were just ordered out, and they went to Belfast and never returned. Their business was put up for sale, and they spent the rest of their years in Broome Street in Belfast, next door to young McKinley's parents, in fact. So there was no backtracking on their exile. William Buttimer of Cahir fled to England, well, fled Wales particularly, in fact, and stayed there, in fact, until August 1923, despite the farm badly needing somebody to work it. Both his father and the workmen had been shot. He did make an attempt to return sometime after the killings, but on his return, his life was threatened again, and he had to go back to Wales. Thomas Bradfield, brother of the murdered John in Cologne, went into hiding after the murder. He returned some weeks later, and also he met with a threat against his life. So he left for England, and the rest of his days were spent in Exeter. Now, I want to tell you about somebody who sort of wasn't directly targeted, but the fear and terror sort of ruined his life, in fact. Francis Peyton of Manway was a draper with a shop a few doors from David Gray's pharmacy, and was a friend of his. He'd been threatened a few times, sometimes before April. Peyton fled with his family in the aftermath of the killing of David Gray. But even in the relative safety of England, he remained convinced the IRA were after him and were going to get him. He eventually broke down completely and committed suicide in 1924. He was one of the hidden victims. Mental health destroyed by fear and terror. But there were other actions being taken. On May the 6th, the following letter appeared in the Southern Star, written by Niles Connolly, the IRA commander. And this was all about threats that were being posted to Protestants to tell them to leave the district. And you'll notice his denunciation of it. But you'll also notice the second half of the letter, where there was the editor's comments, which reinforced what Connolly was saying, but also quoted what Childress had said about this the sectarianism of it all. Sorry, excuse me. Now, there was ongoing harassment against local Protestants as well. The IGC committee claims on West Cork Protestants, and particularly ones local to where I lived, give testimony of continuing harassment throughout 1922 and beyond. Demands for money, borrowing and taking transport, occupying homes, destroying crops and animals, boycotting, forced labour, foiling and interfering with sale of land, all the usual sort of low-level stuff that made life difficult. Now, during my search for my own family tree, my own family history, I came across previously unknown English cousins. This was a cluster of related families who had settled in the market town of Tame in Oxfordshire. It consisted of about 10 families in all, named Good, Bradfield, Stokes and Wood. All had left 1922 or soon after. Now, and the other amusing item I found in the Southern Star was this ad from William Goodwood, himself in exile in Britain, who was advertising a farm in Wales. So it's probably indicative of what I think William Goodwood was always open to market opportunities, and he saw this as one. I'm not sure whether anybody bought it, mind you. Now, I'd like to sort of do a brief sort of look at sort of on the broader subject, let's say, of Protestant population change. Have I gone too fast? Yes, I have. Sorry. During this time, I think Yeah, I'm there. Right. Sorry, never mind those. I'll sort those out later. Now, the Protestant population of Cork County stood at what I call the native Protestant population. That is, these people born in Cork County stood at about 25,500 in 1911 and had fallen to just 16,000 by 1926. There were also another 4,500, probably non-natives, still about in 1926. Made up mainly of treaty port British troops, their dependents, and over 3,000 other civilian non-natives. Now, this overall, I thought this represents a native decline of some 37%, which is a figure significantly higher than the national figure for Protestant decline. So do we form some relationship between exile and violence? I don't know. Now, the other thing about there's been a lot of argument that the decline in Protestants between 1911 and 26 was actually about natural decline. They stopped producing kids, stopped marrying, etc., etc. But in actual fact, if you look at the figures for the census of between 1881, between 1881, for 50 years previous, you find that the Protestants were exactly the same percentage of the population as they were 50 years before. So there was no relative decline in Protestants. They declined rapidly and... Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah, sorry, I beg your pardon. So they declined rapidly. So they declined rapidly from 10% to 7% between 11 and 26, but were steady at about 10% for the previous 50 years. Now, my argument always is that I haven't heard anybody talk about Catholic infertility causing their equal level of decline. Sorry, now I want to show you this graph shows you what the relative marriage rates were, because the other thing was they stopped marrying, therefore they stopped producing kids. So if you look between 1881 and 1911, you actually find the Protestant, the blue line, shows a marriage rate which is far in excess of the Catholic rate. So, and by 1911, the two marriage rates became the same and remained the same for the next, till 1936 anyway, and beyond. So reports of Protestants, all single Protestant ladies dominating the scene at the age of 60, then are grossly over-exaggerated, I think. It has to be said both marriage rates are fairly poor. Right, that one. But, yeah, okay. Now, I want to go on to a second sort of look at more Protestant marriages, and that's what happened to Protestant marriage numbers between 1911 and 1926. As you can see, there was a dip for the First World War, but by 1920, the marriage numbers were exactly the same as they were in 1911. But they collapsed dramatically in the next 4 years. And now, this was not just in the Garrison counties, this was widespread, this was everywhere. And suggests to me that it wasn't just the British leaving, it was the pool of Protestants that were still about was dwindling very fast. They were all getting out, I'm afraid. So, in conclusion, let's return to the Bandon Valley. There were widespread and haphazard attacks on over 30 Protestants, sparked mainly by the death of Michael O'Neill. Little planning appeared to go into it. In some cases, the intended target was not available. A subject was killed instead. The need to inflict pain and death seemed to be the uppermost in the minds of the attackers. Revenge for Michael O'Neill's killing certainly was a factor to trigger it, but then it seems to have taken a life of its own. Protestants only were killed, and in general, Protestants only were targeted, if we add in the two, what I would say, questionable Catholics. But the attack seemed to have largely ignored those records which suggested who the IRA, official IRA intelligence sources said were actually, might have actually done something to help the British in the past. I should say whether they did or not is another matter. If the IRA suspected them, if the IRA suspected them, they would be on the list. Now, contemporary commentators from Childers, even Niles Connolly, and the editor of the good old Southern Star recognised all these taxes as sectarian at the time. In my view, the perpetrators were most likely local IRA men, possibly aided by Bandon associates and our family of Michael O'Neill. It seems highly improbable to me that the IRA garrison was unaware of what was going on in the town on that Wednesday night. There is a local story in the Ballinean area that for years afterwards, one of the killers periodically visited his victims' farms as part of his work. Now, I cannot think of the pain of continually meeting that man on the part of those people. So I'd like to end by sort of saluting the victims and the victim families and the West Cork Protestant community of that time. Perhaps 100 years on, it's time to recognise their courage, their strength, their resilience, and their forbearance. Thank you very much.